All right, so you are here watching this guy so that you can learn about two of our five important biogeochemical cycles, right? The carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. And these get a little messy. I'm just going to give you a heads up. And even with my fantastic drawing and writing abilities, things are going to get a little messy. I'll do my best to clean it up as we go and describe what's going on. But this can be a lot of information, a lot to try to gather all at one time. Okay? I'm going to try to use multiple colors. Hopefully, color coding some things will help a little bit. All right? But keep in mind, what we need to be able to do is to map out for the carbon cycle, which we'll start with, how carbon gets into and out of different what we call carbon reservoirs, so places that we find lots of carbon, okay? And our major reservoirs, by the way, are already listed up here. We've got the atmosphere, we've got biomass, we've got rocks, we've got the ocean, and then of course kind of this idea of fossil fuels, which will be the last part we talked about, because that's really that human implication that comes up here just a little bit, okay? So, let's jump in. Let's do this. All right, so we have a review. So these are some of the things we've already talked about, all right, in terms of the carbon cycle, right? So we'll go over this part a little bit quickly. But first of all, we need to recognize that in the atmosphere, our primary molecule that we find carbon in is CO2. So this is going to be our most important. There are other molecules in the atmosphere that contain carbon, but carbon dioxides are one that's kind of the most important for our carbon cycle. Methane may be our second most important, all right? But for the most part, when I say carbon in the atmosphere, the vast majority of those molecules would be carbon dioxide, okay? So as we've learned with our discussion of photosynthesis and respiration, right? Carbon dioxide can be pulled out of the atmosphere into biomass. And we know that that process is called photosynthesis. Photosynthesis. All right? So that is the actual process that brings CO2, carbon dioxide, from the air and brings it into our plant materials. And then it can work its way up through consumers and secondary consumers and so on. The photosynthesis is the process that we actually bring it back in. Now, likewise, we have the reverse of photosynthesis, essentially. We call it the reverse process of respiration, right? Which is going to bring carbon from biomass, right, back into the atmosphere. We call that cellular respiration. Okay? Now, it is worth differentiating different types of respiration, okay? And this is where methane becomes a little bit important to us in some cases, right? So, if our respiration is anaerobic, okay, meaning if that respiration occurs in an oxygen-free environment, so we don't have oxygen or minimal oxygen, right? Different types of organisms, using microbes, can actually decompose or go through respiration either as a fermentation, which can actually produce alcohol sometimes, but or an anaerobic respiration that produces methane, which is another important gas that contains carbon in our atmosphere. All right, just not as common as our CO2. All right. So we have photosynthesis, bringing it out. We have cellular respiration and anaerobic respiration. Put it in back into the atmosphere. Okay? Now, some other important processes that put CO2 in the air involving biomass. Another one would be combustion, right? So in the case of wildfires, so fires, forest fires, grassland fires, and so on, when we burn biomass, we're going to put CO2 back in the air. And I'm also going to include with our respiration decomposition, right? That is simply a type of respiration, but it's worth differentiating. Okay, so when our bacteria and our fungus decompose biomass, so dead plants, dead animals, they decompose, that's a type of respiration, right? And it sends stuff back into the atmosphere. And again, if it happens in an oxygen-free environment, you get methane. If it happens with oxygen, we tend to get CO2, all right? So there is some interaction with biomass and the atmosphere with carbon dioxide. Now, this being a cycle, of course, right, we don't really have a true starting point. We're kind of just starting with the atmosphere because the place that probably has the most influence on us, at least, okay? Now, so I think that's a fairly robust look at the interactions between biomass and the atmosphere in terms of carbon. Now, it is worth pointing out again that this is by no means an entirely comprehensive look at the carbon cycle. It's going to be enough for us and where we're going with this, okay? Now, the next place I will talk about is rocks, okay? So, rocks, lots of different types of rocks contain carbon. You know, the most common ones would be things like limestone, right? And marble, and those are actually created from ancient the seashells, right? They get kind of ground up and compacted. They're sedimentary rocks. Marble is a metamorphic version of limestone, okay? But we have carbon-containing rocks. Maybe I should indicate that, right? I'm going to put a little C in a block there, saying that we have rocks that contain carbon, all right? Now, the ways that carbon can get exchanged, right, between rocks and the atmosphere and vice versa, or even other places, is through either heating, so volcanic activity, right? So when it comes to what we did in a laboratory where we heated up the baking soda to model volcanic activity, right? So volcanoes take carbon-containing rocks, right, and send some of that carbon back to the atmosphere, typically as carbon dioxide. So that says volcanic activity, and I'm just going to make a little note that that is CO2. Right? That is too small for you guys to probably read. All right, so volcanoes are actually responsible for a fairly hefty amount of CO2 being put into the atmosphere. So if you go around a volcanic place or anywhere you have like hot springs and geysers and stuff like that, those are probably spewing out a fair amount of CO2 along with some other kind of stinky gases like hydrogen sulfide and so on. Okay, but yeah, so if we heat our carbon-containing rocks up, those can put some CO2 into the atmosphere for us. Which is why we get a lot of CO2 coming out of our volcanoes. All right. Now, another interaction between the atmosphere and rocks is a process called rock weathering. Right. And so, with particular types of rocks, namely things like basalt. Actually, basalt is actually pretty good at absorbing CO2 in the atmosphere, particularly when it's a little bit warm. There's a cool research going into something called the volcano rock weathering thermostat that might be have some important climate implications. Not so important to us, but interesting nonetheless, right? But when we expose things like basalt to carbon dioxide, the carbon dioxide actually aids in the weathering process and ends up getting locked up in the rocks. So rock weathering brings some carbon out of the atmosphere and puts it back into rocks. Okay? Now, let's go over to the ocean. Right? Now, the ocean is a super, super important reservoir for carbon because a lot of the carbon that goes into the atmosphere actually ends up being absorbed by the ocean in a process we call dissolution. Okay, so dissolution, so that is the process by which carbon dioxide, I'm going to put CO2 again, dissolves into water, right? So CO2 is actually soluble in water in various quantities, temperatures, and the balance between the ocean and the atmosphere is like how much is it ends up in there. dissolution of CO2 into the ocean is a big flux in our carbon. There's lots and lots of carbon actually going into the ocean as we speak in that dissolution process. Now, dissolution does have a reverse, of course, and we call it exsolution. So we show it going from the ocean back into the atmosphere as exsolution. All right, and so dissolution is CO2 going into the ocean, being dissolved into the ocean. Exsolution is the reverse of that process. Now, we also have an interaction between the ocean and rocks. All right, and where this comes in is part of our rock cycle. Okay, so we actually have what we call a rock formation. All right, and that was what we modeled with the lab where we had the calcium chloride in one beaker and the sodium bicarbonate in the other beaker. We mixed them together and we got a solid that formed. So seashells in particular and things like coral and so on will eventually, down the road, become something like limestone, are actually minerals formed from the ocean water itself. So the ocean has calcium and bicarbonate ions and stuff like that dissolved in it. Part of the reason the ocean's salty, like that all comes from the weathering of minerals over time, okay? But in the right conditions, biologically catalyzed, especially in this case, we take those ions, like the bicarbonate and the calcium, and create minerals like calcium carbonate, all right? So actually we would say carbonate rock forming, right? So there's an interaction between ocean and the rocks themselves, right? Which is then, if we take this out through a cycle of, tens of millions of years, we eventually go from the ocean, things like seashells and coral, to make things like limestone, right? That limestone can then get buried and then uplifted through some tectonic activity, maybe eventually work its way to a volcanic area, in which case that carbon came out of the atmosphere a long, long time ago, worked its way back. That's a really, really long, long cycle. But an interaction with carbon nonetheless. Now, the last, and certainly not least, in terms of human importance, is this fossil fuel reservoir. Now, we will study fossil fuels specifically, how they form and what types of materials they form from. Somewhere down the road in chapter 11, it is, a whole chapter devoted to fossil fuels. But for the sake of the carbon cycle, super important, okay? Because what we're doing is we're taking these fossil fuels, which entail coal, oil or petroleum, and natural gas. These are all carbon-containing compounds. Now, the reason we call them fossil fuels, by the way, is they are ancient kind of undecomposed remains of plants and algae from a really long time ago. So we have this stored carbon. It's been underground for hundreds of millions of years. We're talking pre-dinosaur ages, right? These vast coal swamps and algal blooms and so on that under conditions that existed way back then were basically buried. And we have this coal, which is made from old kind of coarse woody material, oil and natural gas, which tend to come from our algae, our aquatic plants. But we have carbon locked up in our fossil fuels, right? And so that carbon has kind of been out of this cycle for a really, really long time. Again, we're talking on scales of hundreds of millions of years. Okay? Now, what's happening today? What's going on that's different is humans, right? We eventually figured out that these fossil fuels contain a lot of stored energy, and they're really not that hard to get to, pretty cheap to produce, and we have a ton of energy to get out of it, okay? And the way that we go about getting that energy from these fossil fuels is combustion, all right? And so we dig up coal, we burn it. We drill for oil and natural gas, and we burn it, all right? Now, whenever you burn a carbon-containing fuel, the primary byproduct we're going to get from that is carbon dioxide, which is a gas, right? And so you'll notice here, I'm going to put a single arrow coming from fossil fuels up to the atmosphere, and that is combustion. Okay? Now, what we have to understand about formation of fossil fuels is it is not a realistic timeline to reform these things, right? So even if the conditions were right today to make fossil fuels, it takes, 1,000,000 times longer to form fossil fuels than it takes for us to dig it out and burn it, right? So not a sustainable system. And so we don't have a return arrow here. Okay, there's no way for the atmosphere to, again, start storing itself back in the form of fossil fuels. All right? And so that creates a really, really important implication. And I know I just told you guys when we started this video that we're going to do the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. I'm already running 16 minutes, so I don't anticipate actually getting to the nitrogen cycle. Sorry about that. But I'll be sure to label that when I post the video. So between biomass and the atmosphere, we have, I know there's more arrows pointing up and down, right? But between all of this, we kind of have a system in balance, right? The amount of carbon going out to the atmosphere is equal to the amount being pulled out of the atmosphere, all right? Now, the rock process can create some imbalances, although it would be not necessarily, well, it'd be long-term, but not long-term in geologic terms, okay? You notice we have sort of a balance between volcanic activity and the rock weathering process. Over here with the ocean, we have dissolution of CO2, and we have exsolution of CO2, all right? All of these things kind of create this sort of active carbon cycle, right? Except for this fossil fuels. It's a one-way trip for that carbon from the fossil fuels back to the atmosphere. And so what's really, really interesting, and scary, but interesting, is if we burn all of these fossil fuels, let's say we dig up every last drop that we can manage to get and burn it all, we could end up recreating atmospheric conditions that haven't existed since before the dinosaurs. We're talking hothouse conditions where the ocean surface is 35 degrees Celsius, right? That's hot. We're talking 100 degrees Fahrenheit for just the ocean. Crazy, crazy hot conditions. And so a lot of the rigmarole you hear around this idea of climate change and carbon and is it really happening and so on. Paleoclimate, ancient climate, holds some really important clues for not only is there a really important link between CO2 in the atmosphere and climate, but the fact that we could recreate an ancient atmosphere where things looked and felt, literally felt different. Of course, that would be a long down the road before we got to there. Okay? So, I told you, I promised this was going to be a messy, messy thing for you. Okay? But what you guys are responsible for knowing is pretty much this thing in its entirety. What processes bring carbon in and out of biomass in the atmosphere? What processes bring carbon in and out of rocks? What processes bring carbon in and out of the ocean? And then, of course, what are the implications of us digging up this ancient carbon that's been out of the cycle for hundreds of millions of years? What's that going to mean for the chemistry of our atmosphere? What's it going to mean for global temperatures? It's a later chapter, but a little teaser, preview. All right? So, again, I'm not going to do nitrogen cycle in this one video. I'm going to break it up for you guys a little bit. So we'll do nitrogen cycle next, which may be a little shorter than this one.